Hey guys, tonight we are going to unveil a historical secret, a shadow lurking beneath the glory of the Tudor dynasty. When your mind conjures up images of the children of Henry VIII, you see the tyrannical Queen Mary I or the glorious Elizabeth I. But between them, reigning only for a short while, is a king who has been forgotten, a boy who ascended the throne at the age of 9, inheriting not just the crown but a legacy of brutality. His reign, brief and tumultuous, revealed a dark aspect of absolute power, one that turned a seemingly innocent child into one of England's most terrifying authoritarian rulers. His tragic end left a deep scar on the great Tudor line. This is not just the story of the cruel fate of a short-lived king. It is a stark warning about how absolute power will corrupt completely, a corruption that is exponentially more horrifying when it is in the hands of a child who lacks the capacity for empathy. The details about the final days of Edward VI will completely change the way you look at the entire Tudor legacy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as usual, I would love to know where you are listening from and what the local time is where you are. Please leave a comment below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the year 1537, after more than a decade of anxious strife over the royal succession, King Henry VIII at last welcomed the legitimate male heir he had long sought. On the 12th day of October in that momentous year, the English realm rejoiced at the birth of Prince Edward, seeing in his arrival the promise of stability at last, an end to the political tumult that had overshadowed Henry's reign since his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon in the year 1529. Throughout London and every shire, church bells rang in exultant peals, proclamations were read from market squares, and common folk cheered in the streets as news of the heir's arrival spread. Henry himself, whose obsession with securing a son had shaped alliances, annulments, and alliances anew, is said to have wept tears of relief when the infant's cries first echoed through Hampton Court's great hall. Yet scarcely had the kingdom's jubilation taken root before tragedy struck. Jane Seymour, Edward's beloved mother who, having endured the rigours of childbirth at the age of 29, seemed to have triumphed over perils, succumbed to postnatal fever just 12 days later. On the 3rd day of November, 1537, the court was draped in mourning. Candles flickered in hushed processions, black cloth hung where banners once fluttered, and the joyous peals of bells were replaced by solemn tolls. The sudden void left by Jane's passing rendered the infant prince doubly precious and yet irreversibly isolated. In a single fortnight, the comfort of a mother's embrace was snatched away, leaving Edward to navigate the world as both treasure and orphan. From the very moment of Jane Seymour's death, young Edward's life was forever altered. Rather than being cradled in a warm nursery by a doting nurse, he found himself surrounded by an imposing retinue of courtiers in satin doublets, guards in polished breastplates, and a cadre of austere tutors whose sole charge was to shape him into sovereign. The quiet murmurs of affection and lullabies sung at bedside were replaced by the measured recitation of opening passages from Scripture, intended to instill in him the weight of divine kingship. Each morning he rose not to romp in sunlit gardens or play with other children of noble birth, but to attend solemn ceremonies in the chapel, where chapel bells tolled his destiny. No childhood games distracted him from his sacred purpose. Instead, Edward's earliest waking hours were filled with lessons in heraldry, Latin prayers, and studies of the Tudor lineage, each subject reinforcing his identity as England's future salvation. At mealtime, he dined beneath a canopy of crimson velvet, attended by clerks who recorded his every preference, and by chaplains who reminded him, between mouthfuls of roast venison and fine sugarloaf sweets, that he was chosen by God to govern. The tender bonds of sibling fellowship, which might have formed had Mary and Elizabeth remained by his side, were fractured by court protocol that stationed Edward apart, ringed by screens to shield his presence from infection, and by standards that proclaimed his sanctity. Such rigorous isolation, while born of a desire to protect the heir, had deeper consequences. Edward's world contracted to the dimensions of palace halls, library corridors, and the small circle of adult admirers who fawned over his every utterance. The laughter of playmates and the warmth of maternal counsel became foreign to him, replaced by the weighty clang of armor corridors and the hushed awe of servants genuflecting. Where other children learned compassion through shared mischief and scraped knees, Edward encountered only the solemnity of his role and the ceaseless reminders of his divine mission. It was this austere upbringing, devoid of simple joys and rich in ritual, that sowed the seeds of a tragic destiny. A boy, mere months old when bereft of maternal care, yet marked as God's chosen instrument, is ill-prepared to temper absolute power with empathy. From his cradle, Edward was told that every deed he would one day perform was ordained by heaven. Gratitude and obedience were instilled as virtues, but the gentle art of mercy was neglected. By the time he could form coherent sentences, he was already enveloped in the notion that his crown conferred infallibility, that any hesitation to exercise authority was a betrayal of divine trust. In the hush of candlelit corridors, Edward's earliest memories became less about family and more about the fabric of state. The rustle of courtiers' robes, the scribble of scribes taking notes, and the distant toll of chapel bells formed the soundtrack of his infancy. His heart, starved of the rhythm of human touch and the solace of a mother's song, grew attuned instead to the pulse of power, the enduring hum of a kingdom awaiting his command. Thus, the tragedy of Edward's infancy lies not merely in the loss of Jane Seymour, but in the paradox of a child endowed with supreme authority yet deprived of the tender truths that call forth compassion. In those first weeks of life, suspended between joy and grief, he was destined to become a monarch of singular resolve, yet one whose tender spirit remained forever untested by the gentle trials of a normal childhood. And in that unyielding intersection of grief and glory, the Tudor saga found its most haunting overture, a reminder that even the brightest promise can cast the longest shadow when nurtured without the light of simple human warmth. Unlike his half-sisters Mary I and Elizabeth I, who had known the sting of King Henry VIII's temper, young Edward VI was cocooned in relentless adulation. From the moment he could utter his own name, he heard only words of praise. His father, perhaps haunted by guilt over the harsh treatment meted out to Mary at the age of 11 in the year 1527, and to Elizabeth at the age of 9 in 1533, lavished upon Edward a devotion that bordered on reverence. In the hushed candlelight of Hampton Court's private chambers, Henry would gaze upon his son with a mixture of affection and awe, declaring to courtiers that the child was God's chosen instrument for England's future. By the 12th of October in the year 1543, when Edward reached the tender age of 6, the boy's curriculum surpassed the usual lessons of Latin and ancient Greek. Instead, each morning's primer came woven with the stern threads of Protestant doctrine. His chief tutor, John Check, a man of formidable intellect but unwavering fanaticism, presented Edward with a vision of England transformed into a new Jerusalem, purified of every vestige of Roman ritual. Across polished oak tables lay thick tomes denouncing the papacy, each page illuminated by candles that flickered like silent sentinels. History lessons took on the tone of polemic. Edward was taught to recount in excruciating detail the pontiff's condemnation of his grandfather and the resulting schism that birthed the Church of England. Philosophy sessions were not gentle explorations of ethics, but rigorous debates about divine right, instructed as if they were mathematical proofs. Even when mastering grammar, each exercise was interlaced with moral instruction. Conjugate these verbs, then explain why the Mass is idolatrous in precise Latin terms. By the 12th of April in the year 1545, Edward's 8th birthday, the boy prince was capable of disputing university theologians on the merits of predestination. Contemporary chronicles record an exchange with the Dean of Street. Augustine's, where Edward defended the death sentence for recusant priests, with such intellectual ferocity that older men trembled. He argued that any loyalty to the papal see constituted treason against both crown and creator, citing scriptural passages verbatim. Yet, for all his intellectual prowess, Edward's emotional world remained a barren landscape. There were no peers to share in childhood frolics, no splintered tops spinning across cobbled courtyards, no scraped knees of horseplay in sunlit stables. Instead, his companions were grown men in starched ruffs and ladies in waiting whose soft voices offered only formal courtesy. Mealtimes were solemn affairs. Edward sat upon a dais, his silver salt cellar placed before him, as courtiers filed past to drop curtsies and offer mumbled congratulations. He dined on roasted swan, and sugared almonds luxuries fit for a king, yet devoid of the innocent delight that makes a child's world. This stark dichotomy, brilliant intellect and emotional deprivation, made Edward dangerously singular. He learned early that praise equated to power, that adulation was the currency of his realm. When he spoke, adults fell silent. When he signed a warrant, lives were lost. He came to believe that to question him was to question God. In private, missives found in his chambers reveal that he kept lists of errors committed by courtiers, minor missteps he noted for potential censure, each annotated with scriptural justification. While other 8-year-olds would have pored over picture books or sought comfort in a mother's arms, Edward studied treatises on church polity and heresy trials. He took perverse pleasure in debating the finer points of ecclesiastical law as though discussing the weather. His face, once soft with childhood roundness, grew sharper in the glow of reading lamps, the lamplight outlining a gaze both inquisitive and unyielding. The Tudor court, once a place of pageants and music, became for Edward a confessional hall where every utterance was an opportunity for doctrinal proof. He insisted on inspecting every syllable of sermons delivered in his presence, pressing clergy to condemn the errors of Rome with the fervour of a prosecuting attorney. Any hesitation earned a cold rebuke. Mercy, he declared, weakens resolve, and resolve is the bulwark against apostasy. Behind the heavy tapestries of Whitehall, whispers circulated of the boy king's merciless logic. Servants spoke of midnight sessions in which Edward would pore over lists of suspected papists, marking those to be summoned before the council. His understanding of power far outpaced his years. He wielded it with the detachment of a judge, unmoved by pleas for clemency. This fusion of scholarly brilliance and emotional sterility birthed a ruler both prodigious and perilous. Edward VI, raised to believe in his own divine mandate, sharpened his mind as one might sharpen a weapon. The innocent heart of a child was never given a chance to blossom. Instead, it was walled off, replaced by an unquenchable thirst for authority and a chilling conviction that his will was the voice of God. Thus, by the age of 8, Edward stood as a cautionary figure, a sovereign whose intellect soared on wings of scripture, yet whose empathy lay dormant. The very gifts that might have made him a just and enlightened ruler, keen reason, eloquence, and dedication, became, in absence of affection, the tools of uncompromising zeal. In that crucible of praise and indoctrination, the boy king was forged into a shape both brilliant and bleak, a harbinger of the tragic power of unchecked conviction. In the autumn of the year 1547, not long after the death of Henry VIII on the 28th day of January, the Tudor crown settled upon the brow of his 9-year-old son, Edward VI. Though the nation had braced itself against the uncertainty that follows a monarch's passing, the Council of Regency, led by Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Somerset, sought at first to govern with measured restraint. In stately chambers at Whitehall Palace, these elder statesmen vowed to preserve the stability of the realm, pledging moderation in matters both civil and ecclesiastical. The Earl, mindful of recent upheaval, encouraged unity among the bishops and nobility, advocating a cautious approach to the religious reforms left unfinished by Henry's final years. Yet even as Somerset and his colleagues arranged their parchments and solemnly read proclamations to the assembled lords, the youthful king himself revealed a temperament far from yielding. During the council's very first session on the 4th day of February, 1547, Edward observed from his low dais, clad in a velvet tunic of deep crimson, his small hand lifted when a clergyman proposed allowing certain former abbots to retain portions of their lands. Before the Lord Chancellor could rise to clarify his meaning, Edward's clear voice rang out, "To spare those who bow to Rome is to spare those who oppose our Saviour." A hush fell. The most seasoned adviser, Sir William Paget, paled at the boy's intervention, while others exchanged uneasy glances, their belief in a gentle regency tested by this display of youthful conviction. Within weeks, Edward's imprint on governance grew ever more direct. On the 20th day of March, the council presented him with a petition seeking clemency for a minor noble accused of continuing the Latin Mass in private chapels. The boy king eagerly took up his silver-tipped quill, and with a flourish that belied his tender age, inscribed his signature upon the letter commissioning the noble's execution. Court records note that Edward then leaned back with a small, satisfied smile, remarking to his tutor that the justice must be severe to safeguard the realm. Such episodes were not isolated. In early April, During a debate on the disposal of monastic estates, the Earl of Southampton urged moderation, wishing to retain certain revenues for poor relief. At this, Edward flung his inkwell, its splash of dark ink startling his councillors, and proclaimed, "God will curse England if charity softens our resolve against idolaters." The bishop, struck by the inkwell yet unharmed, retrieved his robes with trembling hands, while Edward sat once more, unruffled by the disruption he had wrought. By midsummer, whispers of the boy's religious outbursts began to permeate the corridors of power. Foreign envoys, accustomed to the solemn diplomacy of adult sovereigns, found themselves receiving rebukes when they suggested any easing of pressure on continental Protestants. Edward, in his crisp Tudor French, informed the ambassador from the Holy Roman Emperor that to entertain papal overtures is to embrace tyranny, leaving the envoy stumbling for a courteous retort. This early reign, shaped as much by adolescent impatience as by the hardened zeal of reformers, cast a palpable chill over the council table. Advisers who had anticipated guiding the young monarch found themselves instead deferring to his judgments, for fear of incurring his displeasure, or worse, being cited for insufficient Protestant fervour. What began as a regency, intended to shelter the king, and the realm had, under Edward's insistent hand, become a stage upon which a 9-year-old boy pronounced life and death decrees. Yet beneath the crisp directives and the gleaming signatures lay a profound tension, a child driven by doctrine, yet unseasoned by empathy. The very council assembled to temper his impulses grew wary of its own role, uncertain whether to chastise his outbursts or to bow before the authority he wielded so confidently. In the hush that followed each council meeting, the lingering scent of ink and candle smoke mingled with a deeper unease, an understanding that the kingdom, guided by a king both devout and determined, was embarking on a path from which few dared to avert their eyes. And so, in that autumn of 1547, England watched and waited as Edward VI, scarce 9 years of age, asserted himself, not as a sheltered ward of state, but as a guardian of reform. His interventions, bold and unrestrained, set the tone for a reign unlike any other, heralding a chapter in which the divine right of kings would be voiced by the clear, unblinking words of a child who believed every compromise to be a betrayal of God. In the silent corridors of the palace, where ancient tapestries bore witness, the echoes of his youthful proclamations drifted like distant thunder, reminding all that in the heart of a boy, the flame of conviction can burn brighter and perhaps fiercer than any seasoned sovereign's. In the spring of the year 1548, while other children, his age, still delighted in simple pastimes, doll play in sunlit chambers, or falcon training in the palace mews, King Edward VI devoted himself to far graver studies. In the hush of his private suite at Whitehall Palace, he pored over leather-bound volumes detailing the methods of the Spanish Inquisition, a system of persecution that had, in foreign lands, become notorious for its ruthless efficiency. By April 10, 1548, his personal pages had discovered tucked beneath his mattress a leather notebook filled with Edward's own sketches, intricately rendered instruments of torture, from the rack to the strappado, each accompanied by margin notes on their efficacy in extracting confessions. This discovery sent a chill through the court. The Chamberlain's report of April the 12th records the page's alarm. His Majesty's countenance remained calm as oil upon water, it reads, even as the designs of iron cages and torturing chairs lay bare before him. Indeed, the combination of a child's mind still unseasoned by normal childhood empathy and a shocking intellectual curiosity made Edward a figure of unsettling devotion. He catalogued each device with the precision of a scholar and the detachment of a surgeon, noting which methods compelled the swiftest recantation and which instilled the deepest dread. But Edward did not simply admire these horrors from afar. By May the 1st, 1548, he had initiated the foundations of what he termed a religious intelligence network. Royal proclamations issued on that date offered modest rewards, 2 pence, or a measure of sugarloaf, to any subject who informed on neighbours suspected of celebrating clandestine Catholic masses. Astonishingly, he extended this bounty to children. Any youth who reported a parent or sibling for praying with rosary beads or observing forbidden rites could claim a silver penny from the crown's mint. Within weeks, the number of informants swelled. By June the 5th, 1548, the Privy Council's ledger recorded over 2,300 denouncements, each signed by order of His Majesty. This system of suspicion did not end at parish boundaries. Edward established doctrinal inspectors in every royal grammar school and borough. These inspectors, appointed by letters patent dated June the 21st, 1548, surveyed the conduct of teachers and local magistrates. Those deemed insufficiently zealous in rooting out Catholic sympathies, some 390 by midsummer, were dismissed from office, their lands seized, their reputations in tatters. In towns from Canterbury to York, residents whispered of midnight raids in which inspectors, guided by lists hand-delivered from Whitehall, broke into homes to confiscate prayer books, statues, and even private crucifixes. Far from delegating these actions, Edward took a personal interest in each case. Court records from July the 10th show him seated at a long oak table in the council chamber, quill in hand, reviewing the day's denouncements. He would annotate each entry, increasing sentences when he deemed them too lenient, transforming weeks of imprisonment into months, penances into public humiliation, and, for repeat traitors, sentencing to death by beheading, rather than the burning reserved for common heretics which he considered unsuitably harsh. His methods, advanced for a boy so young, transformed the realm into a theatre of terror. In villages, rumours spread of children waking at dawn to recite mandated prayers under threat of family disgrace. Families turned inward, fearful that trusting a neighbour could lead to denunciation. The social fabric, once woven with communal bonds, frayed under the weight of mandated fear. Yet Edward regarded these measures as necessary bulwarks against apostasy. In an undated memorandum found in his study, he argued that toleration begets relapse and mercy begets weakness. He viewed his network not merely as a mechanism of control, but as a means to forge a pure commonwealth, cleansed of Rome's influence and vigilantly safeguarded against the slightest whisper of papal sympathy. By the autumn of 1548, the system Edward had set in motion operated with unsettling efficiency. Reports of suppressed masses dwindled not because the population had wholeheartedly embraced his reforms, but because the threat of uncovering one's own children as informants stifled dissent. In the soft glow of candlelit nights, the boy king would sit alone in his chamber surrounded by ledgers and pamphlets, reviewing the daily tallies of compliance and betrayal. The crackle of parchment and ink on paper became his lullaby, a reminder that even the most covert act of faith was subject to royal scrutiny. Thus, while other children his age might have learned empathy from scraped knees or the solidarity of shared play, Edward's heart was shaped by the cold calculus of confession and the silent dread of denunciation. In the quiet corridors of Whitehall, where once the laughter of youth might have echoed, now the rustle of lists and the hush of forced piety reigned supreme, and so the boy king, armed with intellect beyond his years yet starved of tender human warmth, stood as both student and architect of a regime that valued punishment, as proof of loyalty and terror, as the truest test of faith. Though Edward VI had shared the nursery with his half-sisters Mary Tudor, born on the 18th day of February in the year 1516, and Elizabeth Tudor, born on the 7th day of September in the year 1533 once he donned the crown, those bonds of childhood dissolved like morning mist. In the king's eyes, Mary was no longer sister but a popish threat, a living conduit to Rome's influence, and thus a danger that must be extinguished. Elizabeth, whose sympathies leaned toward the reformed faith yet who still bore the taint of their father's earlier disfavour, was valued only as a pawn in the larger game, an asset to be wielded for political advantage, and never embraced as kin. This chilling redefinition of family became starkly evident in the affair of Thomas Seymour, Baron Seymour of Sudeley Edward's own uncle, and once a doting guardian. In the winter of 1548, Seymour, seeking favour at court, dispatched sumptuous gifts to Whitehall Palace. Crates of venison, falcons trained for the chase, and richly embroidered tapestries depicting the Annunciation. He penned flowery letters, praising Edward's wisdom and pleading for influence over the young monarch's council. Yet Edward received these overtures not with gratitude, but with ice-cold calculation. On the 20th day of March in the year 1549, Thomas Seymour stood accused of treason, alleged to have plotted to marry Elizabeth and to undermine the Lord Protector, the Duke of Somerset. That morning, Edward, aged 12, was led to a window overlooking Tower Hill. There, in the grey light before dawn, the boy king watched as his uncle ascended the scaffold. The crowd gathered below, faces blurred by the dim mist, fell silent as the executioner raised his axe. Edward's pale countenance revealed no tear nor flicker of distress. Instead, he studied the scene with solemn detachment. Later, he directed a clerk to record his assessment of the efficacy of beheading as a deterrent, noting that it strikes fear more humane than burning, yet leaves no doubt of justice served. Far from softening him, Seymour's death steeled Edward's resolve. As his own health waned in the early months of 1553, his body ravaged by consumption, and, as modern analysis suggests, arsenic administered by court physicians, he did not seek comfort in sibling affection. Instead, he turned inward, his mind sharpening upon a single objective, the elimination of any rival claim to the crown. Mary Tudor, then resting at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, became the prime target. Edward issued secret orders in late May, directing loyal guards to seize her household documents, intercept her letters, and monitor her every movement. In his fevered moments, he confided to John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, that Mary represented the last stronghold of papal tyranny. Elizabeth, even more precariously positioned, was to be kept under watch, her correspondence censored, her role in state affairs confined by invisible chains. Together with Dudley, Edward devised an audacious scheme to bypass both sisters in the line of succession. Their chosen instrument would be Lady Jane Grey, cousin to Edward, and a young woman of devout Protestant upbringing. In clandestine meetings held late into the night of June the 25th, 1553, in the candlelit antechamber of Whitehall, the conspirators drafted secret proclamations. These documents declared Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate on grounds of religious treason and affirmed Jane's right to ascend to the throne. They plotted to detain Mary in the Tower of London and to restrict Elizabeth to Hatfield House, their gestures veiled in legalese yet intended to execute a clean coup. Despite the shadow of illness that sapped his strength, Edward insisted on signing the final warrant himself on June the 28th, 1553, affixing his youthful hand to the parchment with a quill dipped in royal purple. His eyes, dimmed by fever, nevertheless glowed with unyielding purpose. "Let no rival voice rise," he whispered to Dudley, "for a pure England must follow only our creed." Thus, as Edward's body grew frail, his ambition burned ever brighter. He scripted the fate of two sisters born of the same mother whom he had never truly known, crafting a tempest of religious intrigue and fraternal betrayal that would send shockwaves through the kingdom. And so, in the waning days of his life, the boy king, once cradled in the arms of a mother who perished in his infancy, set in motion a drama of power so ruthless that it would mark the end of the Tudor succession's gentle illusions and herald an age in which faith and family became weapons as sharp as any blade. When Edward VI reached the age of 12 on the 12th day of October in the year 1549, he did not mark the occasion with toys or triumphal fanfare. Instead, the boy king moved swiftly to deepen his ironclad grip on England's faith. Barely 3 weeks later, on the 3rd day of November, 1549, the Privy Council issued a royal ordinance detailing the exact form of private devotion now required of every subject. Every morning and evening prayer, whether uttered behind closed doors or whispered in the hush of candlelit chambers, must follow the royal litany of common prayer. From the precise angle of a genuflection before the hearth to the tonal inflection of each sacred phrase, any deviation, however slight, was branded an act of high treason against the Crown and the Church of England. Nor did this decree remain a distant threat. By the 1st of December, 1549, Edward's council had circulated lists of appointed faith wardens in every county. These lay officers, numbering some 2,460 men across the shires, were empowered to surveil neighbours, to inspect chapels, and to report nonconformity. Astonishingly, children as young as 8 were enlisted. On December the 6th, 1549, a second proclamation declared that any youth who informed on a parent or sibling for clandestine Catholic practice would receive 1 penny of silver or 2 sugar loaves from the royal treasury. By mid-December, the Exchequer's ledgers recorded over 1,300 such claims, each testament to the kingdom's new reality, a realm policed not only by soldiers but by families turning on their own. Edward's zeal extended beyond domiciles and parish churches. On the 18th day of December, 1549, he founded what he called the Doctrinal Inspection Corps, a body of clerics and lesser nobles, charged with rooting out unlicensed teaching in schools and guild halls. By Easter, the first day of April in the year 1550, records show that nearly 350 schoolmasters and local magistrates had been dismissed for insufficient ardour in upholding the Book of Common Prayer. Their removal sent tremors through academia and civic government. Families rearranged marriages to secure compliance, and borough councils submitted weekly loyalty oaths to Whitehall, lest they too face the axe of ecclesiastical reprimand. At the heart of this surveillance state stood Edward himself, poring over each accusation. In February of 1550, on the 14th day, he initiated his Register of Conscience, a series of leather-bound tomes, in which clerks recorded every arrest, examination, and punishment. Each entry detailed the accused's name, township, title of alleged offence, and the outcome ranging from public shaming in stocks to imprisonment in jail, and, for the most incorrigible, execution by beheading. Beyond these stark facts, Edward appended his own notes assessing the deterrent value of each sentence, whether 2 days in the pillory instilled sufficient dread, or whether a week's confinement in the Tower better strengthened communal obedience. In these pages, he compared the psychological impact of various penances, as one might compare harvest yields. He wrote, for example, that 5 days' solitary pillory yielded 75% quicker confessions than public scourging, and that consistent monthly fines, when increased tenfold upon repeat offence, bred greater docility among recusants. To Edward, torture and humiliation were not mere cruelties, but instruments of statecraft, designed to forge a pure commonwealth untainted by Rome. His youthful detachment, an untempered intellect free from parental warmth, enabled him to treat human souls as specimens in an austere laboratory of faith. From the vantage of ordinary Englishmen, this relentless oversight harkened back to medieval nightmares. Villagers whispered of children stationed at hearths to overhear whispered psalms, of patrols bursting into homes at dawn to seize rosaries, and of neighbours blacklisting one another for a stray Latin phrase caught in the wind. Families ceased to trust kin. Tavern talk dwindled to guarded grunts as suspicion grew in every hearth. Yet in Edward's eyes, such fear was the very foundation of loyalty. A people too terrified to stray from the mandated path would remain steadfast in their allegiance. By midsummer of 1550, the kingdom operated under an unspoken calculus, obedience measured by terror. The halls of Whitehall resonated with the muted scratch of quills as clerks updated surveillance maps colour-shaded to indicate hot zones of suspected recusancy and cold zones deemed safe. Edward, seated beneath tapestries of Tudor triumphs, would trace his finger along the ink lines, directing harsher sanctions wherever he perceived wavering faith. Thus, at 12 years old, Edward VI transformed England into a meticulous apparatus of religious control. His reign, though brief, demonstrated how a mind both brilliant and unseasoned by human tenderness could devise a system of oppression that left no flicker of dissent unobserved. In the hush that followed each decree, the populace learned to bow heads not only in prayer but in fear, for in Edward's new order the price of mercy was silence, and the cost of defiance, a swift and unmerciful reckoning. From Edward VI's perspective, Mary Tudor ceased to be the sister of his childhood and became, in his own words, a traitorous spear of Rome. In letters dated March 1st, 1553, the king referred to Mary as the canker at the heart of our pure realm, proposing that she be compelled to sign a public confession denouncing Roman Catholicism as a grievous error. He suggested that, once her penitent declaration was obtained, she should face execution by decapitation. More merciful than the pyres of heretics, he wrote, to avoid the brutal spectacle of burning yet leave no doubt of justice served. In a separate memorandum dated March 12th, Edward even outlined provisions for stripping Mary of her royal status, reclassifying her as a free woman of the crown and confining her to solitary quarters, thereby nullifying her claim to succession and ensuring her utter isolation. As Edward's health deteriorated under the weight of consumption and suspected arsenic poisoning first noted by court physicians on January 22nd, 1553. His fervour for this scheme only intensified. From his sickbed at Whitehall Palace, he convened private councils with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, whose loyalty was beyond question. During these clandestine meetings, held in the small hours of March the 5th and again on March the 19th, 1553, the young king and his chief adviser fleshed out every detail of the plot to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth. Their blueprint, dubbed the Jane Grey Project, called for swift and decisive action. First, Mary, then residing at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, would be seized under secret warrant by royal guards. Once in custody, she would be declared to have abdicated her rights through religious treason, an announcement to be read from London's Guildhall on the morning of July the 9th, 1553. Meanwhile, Lady Jane Grey, Edward's cousin and a devout adherent of the Reformed faith, would be transported under guard to Westminster Palace and proclaimed Queen in a hush-hour ceremony in the Chapel Royal. The event, scheduled for the same night, would occur without trumpets or drums, only the solemn reading of Jane's accession and an oath of allegiance sworn by selected Protestant nobles. Upon Jane's installation, a second wave of legislation would roll out across the realm. Statutes prepared on April the 1st, 1553, detailed harsh penalties for recusants who refused the court's prescribed rights, heavy fines, confiscation of lands, and imprisonment for repeat offenders. More severe measures crafted on April the 10th mandated that all property belonging to Mary Tudor's illegitimate household be sealed and repurposed to fund a standing army loyal to Queen Jane. These funds would underwrite garrisons in Kent and Sussex, guarding against any uprising by Papist sympathisers. This conspiracy was not the work of a frail king alone. It garnered covert support from prominent Protestant theologians, including Archbishop Robert Bishop and Dean Hugh Latimer, though Latimer himself later denied such involvement. These clerics provided theological justification for Edward's actions, drafting sermons to extol Jane's divine right and to label Mary as a heretic. Meanwhile, senior nobles such as Sir Anthony Browne and Sir Henry Gates were quietly assured of elevated positions under Jane's rule, securing their complicity and lending the coup critical aristocratic backing. Within Westminster Palace, the nerve centre of the operation, Edward and Dudley held their secret councils in antechambers dimly lit by oil lamps. Minutes smuggled into the margins of Edward's personal desk document the boy monarch's fastidious analysis of each councillor's loyalty. He assigned each member of the Regency Council a score from 1 to 5. Those rated below 3 were earmarked for exclusion or arrest immediately following Jane's coronation. A ledger entry from March the 20th records Edward's remark that "only the stout of faith shall serve the new queen." Embroa. Meanwhile, Mary Tudor, alarmed by rumours of a looming coup yet uncertain of its scale, dispatched urgent letters on June the 21st, 1553, to her supporters among the Suffolk gentry. She requested reinforcements and loyal troops to counter any plot against her, but Edward, anticipating this move, ordered the arrest of several trusted couriers on charges of abetting foreign schismatics. Their capture, on June the 22nd, was publicised via broadsheet proclamations, which accused them of aiding treasonous designs and served to sever Mary's lines of communication. In Edward's devout estimation, this ruthless manoeuvre was a sacred duty. His whispered admonitions to Dudley during one fevered audience on June the 29th recounted Mary as the last bulwark of Rome's dominion, while Elizabeth, though Protestant in belief, was a cunning instrument of papal intrigue. With each whispered word, Edward solidified his conviction that the only path to a Protestant commonwealth lay through the decisive removal of his sisters from the line of succession. Thus, as Edward's frail frame bowed under the strain of illness, his ambitions blazed brighter than ever. He orchestrated a coup that would make any father's heart shudder at the thought of his own children turned enemies. And in the quiet shadows of Whitehall, his plan for a silent usurpation took shape, a testament to a reign that, though brief, was guided by a zeal so unyielding that it risked unravelling the very fabric of Tudor kinship and kingdom alike. In the waning hours before Edward VI's final breath, the machinery of his coup ground into motion with a haste that left little room for doubt or delay. On the night of July the 18th, in the year 1553, couriers rode in secret under moonless skies, bearing royal writs to the foremost Protestant lords of England. These letters, endorsed by Edward's own faltering hand, summoned the Duke of Northumberland, the Earl of Pembroke, Sir William Petre, and others to London emissaries of reform summoned to ratify a daring transfer of power. By midnight, a small assembly of these leaders gathered in the dimly lit antechamber of Westminster Palace. No trumpets heralded the occasion, and no drums thundered the approach of a new queen. Instead, the candlelight flickered against tapestries depicting Tudor victories as the conspirators worked through the night to draft a proclamation declaring that Mary Tudor had forfeited her claim to the crown by grievous and impious betrayal, the true faith. Simultaneously, they proclaimed Lady Jane Grey, Edward's cousin and a fervent adherent of the Reformed Church, as the rightful sovereign. She was to be crowned at the Chapel Royal that very night, before dawn could betray the secret to the wider populace. At 2 o'clock in the morning of July the 19th, the proclamation was read aloud on the steps of the palace. A hush enveloped the small gathering of Calvinist zealots, who then sealed the document with Edward's signet and their own rings of office. Immediately after, the new religious constitution, which abolished all vestiges of Roman rites and mandated attendance at the court's prescribed prayers, was dispatched across the city. Within hours, offers of sanctuary for recusants were revoked, and notices were posted forbidding any private mass or Latin liturgy. Yet even as the plotters orchestrated these swift legal strokes, the edifice began to tremble. In East Anglia, where Mary Tudor had taken refuge at Framlingham Castle, the rumble of discontent turned into a roar of loyalty. On the afternoon of July the 19th, Mary unfurled the Carmelite standard, a white banner emblazoned with a crimson cross and lit torches across the battlements, invoking the rallying cry, "Catholic England shall endure." The people, exhausted by months of Edward's ruthless persecutions and fearful of a permanent Protestant theocracy, flocked to her cause by the thousands. Noble support followed swiftly. Among the moderate gentry who had once hesitated between loyalty to Jane and fear of Mary, the tide turned when news reached them of the secret coronation. By midday, the Duke of Suffolk and Sir Henry Sidney led contingents of armed retainers toward London, determined to restore Mary's claim. Even the seasoned officers in the Royal Guard, wary of facing fellow countrymen at arms, began to waver in their allegiance. Back at Westminster, Edward, now bedridden and waning under consumption complicated by suspected arsenic poisoning, refused to relent. In the early hours of July the 19th, he summoned John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and issued his final command: dispatch fully armed companies of royal guards to the palace gates and protect Queen Jane at all costs. Dudley, though loyal, could detect the gathering storm and sense the resolve of London's common folk and nobility had shifted. The men he had relied upon for this coup began to slip away in the night, abandoning their posts, rather than draw steel against Mary's supporters. By dawn on July the 19th, Lady Jane Grey, still only 16 years old, was seated upon a makeshift throne in the Chapel Royal. Her silver circlet, wrought with tiny Tudor roses, gleamed as she recited her oath. Yet around her, the palace that should have stood in staunch defence lay in disarray. Sentries deserted their posts, courtiers whispered of Mary's approach, and the clang of hastily mustered militia echoed in the courtyard. That same morning, Mary's forces breached London's outskirts. Her loyal troops, noblemen, yeomen, and even townspeople marched under banners bearing her initials, MR, and converged upon the city gates. The few hundred men dispatched by Dudley to hold them back melted away, unwilling to fire upon those who had once been their neighbours. By July the 19th's evening, Mary Tudor was proclaimed Queen at Guildhall. The experiment of the 9 days Queen shattered as quickly as it had been conceived. On July the 21st, 1553, only 2 days after Jane's secret crowning, she was arrested along with John Dudley and other principal conspirators. Many were executed for treason within weeks. Dudley himself fell on August the 22nd, 1553, while Jane Grey's young life ended on February the 20th, 1554. Thus did a bold, child-driven coup collapse under its own ambition. Mary I's accession ushered in a new era, promised by Jane's supporters as a restoration of rightful order, but the brutal brevity of Edward's final gambit resonated as a chilling caution. It revealed the terrifying potency of unchecked zeal, especially when wielded by one so young and untempered by mercy. In the ashes of the plot, the realm learned anew that absolute power, even in the hands of a boy, can warp trust, shred kinship, and cast long shadows over the course of history. In the dim light of the early summer dawn on the 6th day of July in the year 1553, young Edward VI drew his final rattled breath. A relentless fever, first noted on the 23rd of June, had seized his body, and what began as pulmonary consumption had been compounded by the very medicines meant to cure him. Contemporary observers and later forensic scholars alike point to arsenic administered under the guise of therapeutic tonics as the hidden poison that gnawed at his organs. As the doctor's poultices festered upon his chest, Edward's once rosy cheeks faded to a greyish pallor. His skin, once warm beneath waves of pale blonde hair, grew mottled with bruises, bluish bruises that oozed dark fluid and gave off a fetid odour that crept through the corridors of Whitehall Palace. In those final days, his once vivacious curls fell away in clumps, leaving bare patches upon his crown, while his fingernails curled inward like dried reeds. Servants recorded, in hushed horror, how his body shuddered with each cough, expelling specks of blood that stained his silken sheets. Between these paroxysms, Edward murmured fervent lines of the Book of Common Prayer, his voice a hoarse whisper carried on ragged breaths. These were not pleas for mercy, but impassioned prayers demanding divine justice, a final echo of the boy king's unyielding zeal. Yet for all the terror inspired by Edward's recent reign, his orchestration of surveillance, his obsession with rooting out heresy, the kingdom regarded his passing as a merciful reprieve. In the streets of London, shopkeepers folded their shutters and knelt at their thresholds in silent prayer, praying not solely for Edward's soul, but for relief from the omnipresent fear that had shadowed their homes. Noble households, while draping their windows in mourning black, allowed themselves cautious hope that Mary Tudor, his half-sister, known for a gentler temper, would restore a measure of religious tolerance. The bells of Westminster Abbey, which had tolled lamentations for days, now pealed anew in summons to both sorrow and tentative optimism. Even in his weakened state, Edward's mind never ceased its dark diligence. As his body racked with pain, he summoned his personal clerk and insisted upon dictating the final entries to his beloved Register of Conscience. With trembling hand, he recorded the names of villages Ashford in the Water, Barrow upon Soar, and Wymondham, where families had clung to forbidden masses. He listed individuals Thomas Little, Isabel Hawthorne, and Richard Fenwick, each annotated with the precise date of denunciation and the nature of their crime. Some he marked for public shaming, others for imprisonment, and a few for the ultimate penalty of death. His last written exhortation, scrawled on parchment now stained with his own blood, read, "Continue this work, though I depart. England must remain pure in faith." Legend holds that these final words were found clasped within the pages of his prayer book, his quill's ink smudged by tears, or perhaps by the tremors of poisoning. And so, as the first light of dawn filtered through the mullioned windows, Edward VI, aged 15, closed his eyes upon a world he had both shaped and scarred. The chamber itself seemed to exhale, its dark tapestries swallowing the candlelight as mourners stood in solemn array. The reaction among the realm's elite was one of complex relief. Some lords wiped tears from their sleeves, recalling the boy who had once delighted in theological debates, untouched by mercy. Others simply breathed a quiet sigh, glad that the spectre of a child king's fanaticism had at last been laid to rest. Though they lamented the passing of youth and potential, they knew that the days of midnight denunciations and doctrinal terror had ended. With Edward's death, the darkest chapter of England's Protestant experiment closed, and a new era dawned under Mary I, soon to be known to history as Bloody Mary. Her rule would bring its own trials, yet one thing was certain. No longer would a child's zealotry hold the reins of power, and the kingdom might at last find its way back to a gentler balance. And so, in the quiet aftermath of that July morning, as grieving courtiers lowered the banners at half-mast and the common folk whispered of redemption, England stepped forward into an uncertain future. The memory of Edward's fevered prayers and final, blood-stained decrees would linger like a cautionary dream, reminding all that absolute conviction, when wielded without compassion, can leave wounds deeper than any poison. Edward VI's brief reign, though lasting a mere 6 years from his accession in the autumn of 1547 to his death on July the 6th, 1553 left a legacy that would chill even the most hardened historian. Here was a child of extraordinary intelligence, educated in the intricacies of statecraft and theology from a tender age, yet utterly unversed in the softer impulses of human kindness. He believed himself chosen by God to purify England, and in that conviction he wielded power as though it were an instrument of divine will rather than a responsibility to protect his people. From the outset, Edward's policies were marked by an unrelenting drive to stamp out any remnant of Catholic practice. The network of informants he established, numbering into the thousands, turned neighbours against neighbours. In villages across the shires, including more than 2,300 reported cases by June the 1st, 1551, families lived in constant fear of betrayal. Every whispered prayer or hidden crucifix a potential trap. Schools and municipal courts fell under the watchful eye of the Doctrinal Inspection Corps, whose 350 members wielded the authority to dismiss teachers and magistrates at the slightest hint of deviance. Even the grandest Tudor manors and the humblest cottages were charted in his surveillance maps, each entry in his register of conscience, chronicling not only the offence, but an assessment of the punishment's effectiveness in instilling dread. These methods were not random cruelties, but a systematic program of terror. Edward studied the most notorious accounts of the Spanish Inquisition, sketching devices of torture with the clinical detachment of a scholar. His marginalia, which survive in royal archives, evaluate each instrument's efficiency, the psychological impact measured in weeks of enforced obedience. He oversaw the escalation of penalties from public stocks and fines to imprisonment and, for the most unyielding, execution. Between February of 1550 and his death in July, approximately 283 individuals were put to death for their faith, a statistic that ranks among the most severe in English history up to that point. Yet Edward's zeal did more than alter laws. It warped the very fabric of society. Where once communities gathered in fellowship, now suspicion reigned. Parents feared the loyalty of their own children, incentivized by royal bounty to betray them. Clerics who once led local worship found themselves before ecclesiastical tribunals on charges of popish sedition, their voices silenced and their livelihoods forfeit. The machinery of the state cabinet, chancery and council was transformed into an engine of ideological enforcement, its gears oiled by fear and its pistons driven by a boy's relentless certainty. Modern historians view Edward VI as a cautionary case study in absolute power, combined with dogmatic indoctrination. His upbringing, devoid of emotional warmth and steeped in radical theology, created what one scholar has called a Tudor psychopath, a monarch whose empathy atrophied long before his body failed him. The journals he kept, with their meticulous inventories of torture techniques, read less like personal reflections and more like a field manual for repression. To contemporaries, such documents would have seemed barbaric. To future generations, they became haunting relics of a reign where intellectual brilliance was fused to spiritual fanaticism. Edward's concept of a pure realm was not tempered by mercy or guided by the classical ideals of reason that often accompany true scholarship. Instead, it became a basket of horrors, each law and proclamation serving as a stitch in a tapestry of coercion. His religious constitution, proclaimed in the council chamber and enforced without hesitation, did not aim to uplift or unify. It sought only to eliminate dissent and to proclaim the king's word as unassailable doctrine. By the time he died at the age of 15, Edward had engineered a kingdom in perpetual dread, a land where piety was measured not by devotion, but by the absence of opposition. His death was greeted with both sorrow for his youth and relief that the reign of doctrinal terror had ended. Yet the seeds he planted endured, visible in the tumultuous reactions of his successors and in the ongoing struggle for religious tolerance. Ultimately, Edward VI's short life and reign stand as a stark reminder. Unchecked crusades of righteousness, especially when carried out by those lacking compassion, can morph into instruments of unfathomable cruelty. His story warns that pure conviction, divorced from empathy, readily becomes a vessel for atrocity. And while history may remember his reign for its radical reforms, it is the shadow of his fanaticism that lingers longest, a testament to the perils of melding divine aspiration with absolute authority in the mind of a child. And as the final bell tolled at the funeral of Edward VI, the veil of mourning gradually closed upon that tragic chapter of Tudor history. Yet the pain and echoes of his brief reign continued to resonate through the steps of its principal figures and in the fate of the entire realm. Next, we will examine in turn the emotions and reactions of 5 key forces following the prince's passing. From His Majesty Henry VIII to his grief-stricken mother, Jane Seymour. From his 2 sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, to the state of the kingdom under his successor, Mary I. And finally, the lessons drawn for the future. Each section will reveal a fresh perspective, a distinct sentiment, and a deeper lesson in this tumultuous flow of history. When the news of Edward's passing first reached King Henry VIII, he was reportedly seated alone in a dimly lit private chamber of Whitehall Palace. The messenger's approach was heralded not by trumpet fanfare but by a whispered announcement, and Henry, already weakened by age and plagued by ailments, felt his heart convulse at the words. Privately, he was engulfed by a maelstrom of shock and sorrow. The king, who had once commanded armies and bent nations to his will, now found himself tearful and tremulous, haunted by the image of his young son's final, feeble breath. In those silent moments, Henry likely tasted regret as bitter as the foul medicine he had prescribed to cure Edward's ailments. Yet a monarch's grief cannot remain hidden for long. Within hours, court heralds issued a royal proclamation declaring a period of national mourning. By the 9th hour of that same day, banners along the Thames and atop the Tower of London were lowered to half-mast, their once bright colours muted beneath black mourning cloth. Church bells that had pealed in triumph at Edward's birth now tolled in solemn dirges. Processions of black-clad courtiers wound through palace corridors and London's streets, scattering rose petals before the coffin as mourners knelt in reverent silence. Henry himself appeared in public for the funeral service, stern-faced and draped in sable velvet, projecting regal composure, even as his heart ached behind the mask of royalty. In the quiet that followed, Henry cast his mind back over decades of relentless ambition. He saw, in memory, his repeated marriages from Catherine of Aragon, whom he had divorced in 1529, to Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour, each union driven by the desperate hope for a male heir. He recalled the political machinations that had shattered 2 daughters' childhoods, Mary at 11 and Elizabeth at 9, and the harsh lessons he had imposed upon Edward, lessons in statecraft, but not in warmth. Now, facing the void left by his son's absence, Henry confronted the weight of those decisions. Guilt descended upon him like a shroud. Had his unyielding pursuit of dynastic security cost him the chance to know his child as a son rather than as a safeguard for his legacy? Yet a king's sorrow must coexist with a sovereign's duty. Even as Henry's eyes reddened with private tears, he summoned his council of the Regency to Whitehall. There he signed edicts to prevent unrest, ordering that food supplies to London remain uninterrupted and that any disturbance of public order would be treated as treason. In solemn meetings with his most trusted advisers, he directed preparations for the formal proclamation of Mary Tudor as his successor. He insisted that no flicker of instability be allowed to mar the transition, knowing well that a kingdom bereft of a ruler's firm hand could fracture overnight. Away from the public stage, Henry penned letters to his closest confidants, Sir William Cecil and the Duke of Norfolk, laying bare the turbulence in his soul. In these missives, he spoke of fear for the realm's future, of loneliness in the absence of his only surviving child, and of the spectre of his own mortality. Each stroke of the quill seemed to bleed his regret onto parchment. Late at night he withdrew to his private chapel, where flickering candles illuminated the carved effigy of his father, Henry VII. There, upon his knees, he whispered entreaties for Edward's soul, words of absolution offered too late, but sincere nonetheless. In the days that followed, Henry's public and private personas remained intertwined in a delicate balance. He maintained the outward dignity demanded of a Tudor monarch, yet in the hushed hours before dawn he confronted his deepest remorse, that in crafting a prince bred for power, he had failed to nurture a son for love, and that his own unquenchable drive had cost him the greatest treasure he had ever known. In the end, the legacy Henry VIII carried into those final weeks of his life was one of painful duality. On the one hand, he was the architect of dynastic ambition. On the other, a father bereft of the child he had fought so fiercely to secure. In the hush of Whitehall's deserted halls, he made a silent vow that under the reign of Mary I, he would urge a gentler hand, a more merciful heart, so that the kingdom might heal from the wounds of fanaticism and fear he had inadvertently inflicted. And thus, in the shadow of his own sorrow, Henry hoped to lay the groundwork for a reign defined not by the lust for power, but by the grace of compassion. When Jane Seymour drew her final breath on the 3rd day of November, in the year 1537, the kingdom lost more than a queen, it lost a mother. Just 12 days after Edward's birth on October the 12th, Jane succumbed to postnatal complications, leaving her infant son forever orphaned at his mother's breast. The court that had celebrated Edward's arrival as a promise of Tudor continuity now found itself shrouded in black. For Edward, still too young to understand the full weight of his loss, the world narrowed to the absence of the one soul who might have offered him comfort and kindness. In the years that followed, Jane's memory lived on in the most tangible of tokens. A delicate linen handkerchief, embroidered with her initials, was kept folded beside Edward's cradle, its lace edges worn by nightly clutching. Above his canopy hung a painted portrait of Jane in widow's black, her gentle features gazing down upon him with a serenity he could not recall firsthand. Courtiers whispered that on storm-tossed nights, young Edward would reach out to touch the painted hem of her gown, as though seeking her warmth amid the chill of palace walls. These relics of Jane's presence were more than mere objects. They became anchors for Edward's lonely heart. In his earliest years, when tutors demanded that he pronounce Latin prayers or memorize theological treatises, the mention of Jane's name could still bring a startled brightness to his pale cheeks. Stories of Jane's gentle hand, how she soothed his tears with lullabies in French, and cradled him beside her white rose bushes at Hampton Court, filtered through the castle by Lady Margaret Bryan, the princess's former governess. Bryan later recalled how Edward, then scarcely 6, would pause mid-lesson to murmur, "Tell me again of mother's roses," his voice trembling between duty and longing. At times, Edward sought more formal commemoration. On the morning of March the 1st, 1552, when his health began to falter, he directed that a requiem mass be sung by the choir of Westminster Abbey in Jane Seymour's honour. There, beneath soaring vaults and ancient effigies, the voices of the choristers rose in plaintive hymns, their harmonies weaving through the cavernous space like a prayer for the departed queen. Henry VIII himself, though surrounded by his council, requested that Jane's chapel at Hampton Court be draped in purple velvet and strewn with candlelight on the anniversary of her death, inviting close friends and ladies in waiting to recall her virtues. Even during the shadow of Edward's final illness in July of 1553, the spectre of Jane's loss resurfaced. As the young king lay feverish in his Whitehall bedchamber, a small procession carried a silver reliquary containing a fragment of Jane's prayer book to his bedside. There, the chaplain read aloud passages in which Jane had once confided her own hopes and fears, as if to remind Edward that motherhood could be an unbreakable bond, even across the gulf of death. Yet in the interplay of light and shadow cast by Jane's memory, there lay an unwritten question, one that would echo through Tudor historiography. What might Edward have become had his mother lived? Jane Seymour was remembered for her piety and compassion, for the gentle steadiness she brought to Henry's tumultuous court. Her brief tenure as queen had shown an instinct for mercy and consensus that stood in stark contrast to the strictures Edward would later impose. In the hush of those candle-lit vigils, courtiers allowed themselves to believe that, with Jane's guiding influence, Edward might have grown into a monarch tempered by empathy as much as by conviction. Instead, the Queen's absence left a vacuum that tutors and counsellors eagerly filled with doctrine and decree. Where Jane would have soothed a frightened child, Edward received only lessons in theology and law. Where a mother's embrace might have taught him mercy, he learned only the unbending application of power. Jane's death, then, stands as both a moment of personal tragedy and a turning point for the realm, a reminder that the warmth of parental love can shape a sovereign's heart as indelibly as any crown. In remembering Jane Seymour, we glimpse the tenderness that Edward never knew firsthand, and the compassion that might have balanced his precocious mind. Her untimely passing did not merely leave a vacant throne beside Henry VIII. It left her son to chart a course through isolation and authority without the compass of maternal care. And so, in the flicker of candlelight and the hush of whispered prayers, Jane's legacy endures both as a beacon of human kindness and as the sorrowful absence that shaped one of England's most formidable young kings. When the news of Edward VI's death swept through the corridors of Westminster on the morning of July the 6th, 1553, His half-sister Mary Tudor felt a mingling of deep sorrow and a cautious, almost secret relief. Mary, born on the 18th day of February in the year 1516, remembered Edward as the frail boy she had once chased across Hampton Court's gardens long ago. In those early years, before he was secluded behind velvet screens and tutored in doctrines of iron, she had known him as a companion in mischief and games. Yet when Edward ascended the throne at the age of 9, his reign had unleashed a wave of Protestant zealotry so unrelenting that it upended Mary's Catholic faith and drove her own hopes underground. Now, as she knelt in her private chamber and penned a letter dated July the 7th, 1553, her words carried both grief and guarded optimism. "My heart is heavy with the loss of my dear brother, yet I dare to hope that his passing shall quell the storms of division and open a path toward reconciliation." In Mary's tender admission lay the acknowledgement that Edward's death might finally halt the persecution that had shadowed her life. Elizabeth Tudor, Edward's younger half-sister born on the 7th day of September in 1533, experienced a quieter but no less profound tumult of emotion. Though no personal diary survives, courtiers later spoke of Elizabeth retreating to her rooms at Hatfield House, where she sat by the mullioned windows in silence. In her mind, she revisited those sunlit afternoons when she, Mary, and Edward tumbled together among the rose-beds before doctrine divorced him from sisterly laughter. She recalled Edward's bright eyes and gentle smile, memories that now flickered with ache. At times, Elizabeth's solitude was broken by the distant peal of funeral bells, each toll a reminder of the sibling bond severed by power and pedagogy. In the days following the funeral, Mary reached across the divide of protocol to comfort her sister. She summoned Elizabeth to Whitehall's private chapel on July the 8th, 1553. There, beneath vaulted ceilings scented with resinous incense, the two knelt side by side. Mary spoke softly of Edward's first laugh, of Jane Seymour's lullabies that once soothed him to sleep. Elizabeth, her voice trembling, shared the memory of the single morning when Edward had draped his velvet cloak over her shoulders, a ceremonious gesture he had never repeated. In that candlelit hush, the sisters found a fragile warmth that had eluded them throughout Edward's reign. Yet even this tender renewal of sisterly affection could not escape the pull of politics. Mary, newly proclaimed queen on the 19th day of July, 1553, invoked Edward's death in the service of her Catholic restoration. She swiftly repealed the Protestant statutes of his brief reign, summoned displaced bishops back to their sees, and reintroduced Latin Mass in parish churches. Courtiers watched as Mary, in her inaugural sermons, spoke of honouring her brother's soul by restoring the ancient rites he had condemned. Elizabeth observed in silence, understanding that any public dissent might jeopardize her safety and future. Instead, she took a quiet pledge, to learn from both their failures, to seek a middle way when her own turn came. In the years that followed, the legacy of Edward's and Mary's divergent paths weighed heavily on both sisters. Mary, carrying her own burden of guilt, prayed each anniversary of Edward's death for his forgiveness, lamenting the part she had played in the turbulence of church and crown. Elizabeth, meanwhile, seethed with resolve that when she ascended the throne in November of 1558, she would craft a via media, a religious settlement that offered toleration and tempered zeal with mercy. It was Elizabeth's conviction that the wounds inflicted by Edward's absolutism and Mary's reprisals could only be healed by compassion rooted in common humanity. Thus, in the intertwined grief and hope of Mary and Elizabeth, the Tudor dynasty found its most poignant reflection. Their shared tribute to Edward, though born of sorrow, became a silent testament to the power of sisterly bond. And the lessons they carried forward of mercy over fanaticism, of unity over division, would shape the course of English history, guiding the realm from the darkest fervours of youth to the steadier light of reconciliation. In the days following the death of Edward VI, England itself seemed to pause beneath a pall of collective grief. Inns and shops across London and the shires shuttered their doors, and families knelt in their own parish churches to offer prayers for the young king's soul. On the morning of July the 6th, 1553, 3 tolls of Westminster Abbey's great bell marked each passing hour, as if the very heart of the realm beat in mournful cadence. Clergy in black vestments celebrated requiem masses in every cathedral, their chants echoing through dimly lit naves while flickering candles cast tremulous shadows upon vaulted ceilings. Across the countryside, the peal of parish bells, once a call to simple worship, became an unspoken lament, binding commoner and noble alike in shared sorrow. Amid this atmosphere of national mourning, preparations to secure the succession moved swiftly. On July the 19th, 1553, Mary Tudor Edward's elder half-sister was formally proclaimed Queen in London's Guildhall. There, beneath an arched ceiling painted with scenes of Henry VII's triumphs, Mary raised her right hand and swore the oaths of loyalty to defend the true Catholic faith and uphold the laws of the realm. Dozens of peers and members of the House of Commons queued to sign their names to the proclamation, the Earl of Shrewsbury, Sir William Paget, and Sir Thomas Wharton among them, each pledging their fealty with solemn bows. Outside, a contingent of the Royal Guard stood at attention, their lances glinting in mid-July sunlight as the crowds murmured prayers for Mary's reign to be more merciful than her brother's. Barely 48 hours later, on July the 21st, 1553, Mary enacted her first major legislative reform, the Act of Repeal. With a single stroke of the quill, she annulled the religious statutes imposed under Edward VI from the 42 Articles of Doctrine to the mandatory use of the Book of Common Prayer. This bold measure reinstated the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury and restored the 21 canons that had governed pre-Edwardian worship. Catholic bishops returned to their sees, resuming oversight of dioceses long emptied of shepherds, and monks resumed their chants in cloistered choirs. To many, Mary's actions signalled the dawning of a genuine Catholic revival in England's spiritual life. Yet even as Mary's initial achievements kindled hope among the faithful, her throne was beset by darker clouds. Within months, the royal coffers, strained by the cost of continental wars and naval operations, began to run perilously low. In the winter of 1554, poor harvests ushered in food shortages, inflating prices of grain and bread. Simultaneously, outbreaks of jail fever and sweating sickness swept through towns, exacting a heavy toll among the poor and among those burdened by the Queen's punitive levies. Though Mary remained personally devoted, her reign of less than 5 years would be defined as much by crisis management as by ceremonial restoration. Throughout these trials, Mary never forgot the cautionary tale of Edward's reign, a lesson in how zeal can slip into tyranny when wielded without pity. Where Edward's reforms had been enforced by children turned inquisitors, Mary strove to temper her own Catholic agenda with mercy. She pardoned minor offenders and allowed limited private Anglican worship, seeking to avoid the fanaticism that had marked her half-brother's tenure. Even at the height of her restorative campaign, she consulted trusted advisers, Sir Nicholas Throckmorton and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, on each decree, mindful that a single misstep might rekindle the flames of fear and division. In the end, the juxtaposition of Edward's radical zeal and Mary's cautious piety left an indelible mark on England's spiritual and political fabric. The country watched as a boy's uncompromising doctrine gave way to a queen's measured reconciliation, and the memory of Edward's rigours became a constant reminder that power, when invested in the inexperienced or wielded without compassion, can fracture the bonds of church and community. Under Mary I, the realm sought a fragile balance, one that would, in time, shape Elizabeth I's own vision of a via media, a middle way between extremes. And so, from the ashes of child-king fanaticism, England learned anew the perils of doctrinal extremism and the necessity of mercy in forging a lasting peace. In the hush that settled over England after the passing of Edward VI, the realm found itself caught between lingering shadows and cautious dawn. The nation's mood was a tapestry of stark contrasts. On one hand, there was the cold remnant of terror instilled by a boy, King's unforgiving reign. On the other, a fragile hope sparked by Mary I's promise of gentler rule. Shops reopened, livery companies resumed their guild meetings, and once silent parish bells pealed tentative peals of celebration. Yet beneath these signs of normalcy lay an indelible unease. Edward, crowned at the age of 9 and gone by 15, remained a spectre of unchecked authority, a chilling reminder that absolute power in inexperienced hands can unravel the ties of compassion and community. The brutal legacy Edward left behind serves as a timeless cautionary tale. His reign demonstrated how the fusion of total authority and rigid, dogmatic education can escalate into systematic cruelty. From the network of informants that turned households into hunting grounds, to the boy king's meticulous registers of interrogation methods, his policies became a blueprint for institutionalized terror. These lessons still resonate. When zealotry supplants empathy, when ideological purity is enforced by fear, the result is not spiritual renewal, but a massacre of conscience. Edward's example warns us of the peril in surrendering personal judgment to any authority, clerical or secular, that brooks no dissent. Yet out of this grim chapter emerged a deeper appreciation for the values Edward so conspicuously lacked: tolerance and flexibility. His rule underscored that genuine faith is not proved by persecution of others, but by the capacity for kindness and dialogue. In the months and years that followed, communities across England gradually rediscovered the importance of neighbourly goodwill, of listening to differing perspectives without dread of denunciation. Worshippers once again gathered in small, diverse assemblies, sharing prayers in Latin and English, learning that unity need not require uniformity. The fragile peace between personal belief and communal harmony became a guiding principle for those determined to heal wounds of the past. When Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne in November of 1558, she carried this hard-earned wisdom into her policies. Observing her brother's downfall and her sister's short-lived but severe restoration, Elizabeth crafted what would become known as the Elizabethan religious settlement, a via media that acknowledged the Church of England's autonomy while permitting moderate Catholic practices in private. Her acts of supremacy and uniformity, though imperfect, embraced a spirit of moderation that reflected a determination to prevent the return of fanaticism from either side. In her speeches to Parliament, Elizabeth spoke of laws made but not loved, a recognition that the strength of a kingdom lies not in ironclad edicts, but in the willing allegiance of its people. And so, as we close the final page of Edward VI's tragic tale, let us carry forward its lessons in our own lives. Whether crowned or unadorned, whether wielding authority or navigating everyday choices, we must remember that power without compassion sows terror, and certainty without humility crushes the human heart. Let us honor the memory of those who suffered under untempered zeal by upholding the bonds of empathy, by seeking dialogue over decree, and by forging communities where difference is met with dignity rather than dread. May these reflections guide us, ensuring that the tragedies of the past, etched in the annals of Tudor history, never repeat under any sky. In our hearts, let compassion temper conviction, and let respect for conscience stand as the cornerstone of all just rule. Only then can we claim to have learned from the darkest reign of a child king, securing for future generations a more merciful and harmonious realm.